So good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join me for this talk, prepared in connection with Toronto Railway Museum Public Program, as Alex has outlined. Actually, a special shout out to my mom, who is also here with us tonight and who has been my biggest supporter and cheerleader in everything that I do, and my colleagues at the TTC who has been cheering me on in my journey in public speaking and authorship in this industry. So thank you, everyone. As Alex mentioned, my name is Yeeman Chen. I'm a Chinese Canadian. I was born in the northern region of China, and I migrated here in Toronto when I was a teenager. For the past 14 years, since 2012, actually, I've worked in public transit here in Toronto, currently, as Alex mentioned, serving in a senior leadership role at the Toronto Transit Commission. I'm very excited to share this hour with you on this topic. My connection to the topic is both personal and professional. As someone of Chinese heritage, a Chinese immigrant to Canada, my story is inseparable from the broader story of Chinese migration to Canada. And of course, as someone who work in modern transit systems, I also see every day how infrastructure shapes belonging, opportunity, national identity, and heritage for the people who live in Toronto. So today, I want to explore Chinese heritage in Canada through the lens of Canadian Pacific Railway, in specific, the construction of the railway, but also go beyond that. And my goal is not just to talk about the hardship that shapes the story we know, but to reframe that Chinese Canadian history as a living story, one that connects the railway of 19th century to how we experience that everyday life in Canada today, and as young professionals working in transit today in Toronto. So before I dive into the topic, I want to acknowledge that the program gave me this opportunity and the Toronto Railway Museum and its effort in spotlighting the story through public interpretation and remembrance. Special thank you to Ryan for encouraging me to present this story to you in celebrating Asian Heritage Month this May. So as we dive into the topic itself, I want to start talking about the history and how the history is framed. From many, for many Canadians, Chinese Canadian history enters that their consciousness through a single moment, the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And I think that's why I'm picking this story as a moment of critical importance to introduce this topic. Um, it has also become a dominant and sometimes probably limiting framing of understanding and appreciation to the Chinese heritage in Canada. This framing influences what we remember, what we commemorate, and what we leave out. So, as we move through this presentation, I invite you to think not only about historical facts, which I will be touching on in some extent, but also about how narratives are constructed, and whose experience get distilled into the symbols of this historical moment and framing. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway occupies a central place in how Chinese Canadian history is commonly understood and presented. The railway dominates the history for several reasons. As the railway itself, it is one of the most significant infrastructure projects in Canadian history. The railway symbolized national unification, industrial progress, economic integration, really from coast to coast, building a country. It quite literally symbolized nation building, actually. In fact, it was 1867 when Canada became a nation of confederation, with British Columbia joining this union of confederation in 1871 by promise of a railway that connects across the country from coast to coast. Chinese labor was deeply embedded in this story because the construction was so visible and essential within this project, and their contribution made one of the few moments when Chinese presence was significant to national history. It naturally dominates that narrative of Chinese Canadian heritage and becoming the primary point through which Chinese heritage is acknowledged even until today. So practically, railway construction brought together themes of migration, labor, and exclusion, all of which are central to Chinese Canadian experience. But the downside of that focus is compressing the context and depth of this point in history and the contribution. So it reduces a diverse, multi-generational community into a single narrative of hardship. And that hardship actually is, as Chinese Canadians, we believe that we shall continue to embrace generations later. And I'm going to talk about that a little later. So to elaborate on the historical framing context, it tends to reduce our complex community to a single historical moment, emphasizing hardship while overlooking resilience, belonging, and long-term contribution. The railway building construction, it represents not only this engineering achievement in Canada, but also that social system that embed and enabled this rapid construction. That system include obviously migration, Chinese migrants to Canada, immigration policy, labor hierarchies, and racialized employment practices. So the goal today, as I mentioned, is not only to understand how that railway came to dominate the narrative of Chinese Canadian history, but also to critically examine how that historical memory is formed and whose story is being emphasized. I hope you can move beyond that commemorating of sacrifice and hardship, and engage with the presence and influence of Chinese Canadians across generations when we reach the end of this presentation. I don't think there are any historical debates that Chinese workers were absolutely essential to railway construction. They were recruited specifically for most dangerous sections of the construction, particularly through British Columbia mountain terrains. I want to share some images here that serves as a reminder to us that the railway is not this abstract achievement, not just a symbol of unification, but rather it's built by human bodies under extreme risk, extreme conditions. These photographs, they do not just represent a distant history. These are evidence of how the labor systems are framed and is framing our history, framing our heritage. Um, this is the condition that we experience, the hardship that we experience, and that's what this is demonstrating. So drive a little bit deeper into these photographs with context. More than 15,000 Chinese labor were recruited to build the western section of the Canadian Pacific Railway. So this is the British Columbia mountain section, primarily due to labor shortages in Canada, cost considerations, and the urgency of completing the project within that political timeline because they represent that unification. They represented um, the country, the establishment of the country. So these workers, many of them came from southern China, were concentrated in the most hazardous sections of construction, as I mentioned, including tunnel blasting, cliffside track laying. Railway company structured this labor along racial lines where the Chinese workers were significantly paid less than their native Canadian counterparts. They're also required to pay for their own food and equipment, working under risk, that are immense, and accidents caused by blasting, landslides, avalanche, and exhaustion were very common. Compensation for injury or death were minimal or non-existent. So from a system perspective, these conditions were not incidental. Um, they're a result of industrial capitalism, racial labor management. So this context reviews how economic imperatives intersects with immigration, with racial policies, producing a workforce that you can say it's indispensable because they're necessary. There's no debate that they are absolutely essential, but also expendable at the same time. The railway, while celebrated as this nation building project, was built upon this system of inequality and shaped not only the project itself while it lasted, but also subsequently the experience of Chinese Canadians within that Canadian society for generations to come. So when we think about the railway alone today, this is generally the photo that comes to people's mind. For many of us, it captures that ceremony, that drive-in of the last spike on November 7, 1885. So it's symbolizing the completion of the railway and symbolically that unification that I talked about earlier of Canada, the real significance of it becoming a country from coast to coast. When we look at this photo itself, what is striking is who is present and who is mostly missing. Although thousands of Chinese workers, actually 15,000 or more, played a crucial role in building the most dangerous section of the railway, they're absent from this image. This absence is also not incidental, just like the working conditions weren't incidental. It accurately reflects whose contribution were considered worthy of commemorating at that time. This photograph visualizes and summarizes the national achievement and progress as we see that it represents the unification of our country. At the same time, it reviews how historical moments are constructed, how it is framed, how it literally sits in the frame, um, and celebrating that political and corporate leader while rendering the labor effectively invisible is how we experience our heritage. Um, as we continue to move along the presentation, I want to ask you to keep this moment in mind because this is really where I pivot on how we experience our heritage. Um, the completion of the railway in 1885, as the last spike is driven into the ground, did not mark an end to the Chinese presence in Canada. It initiated a new and equally challenging phase of life under systemic exclusion. With railway employment largely ended, many Chinese workers transitioned into industries such as service industries like laundry work, restaurants, doministic service, and small scale commerce. At the same time, Chinese Canadians face some most explicit racial based legislations in Canadian history, actually. Federal policies such as the Chinese head tax from 1885 to 1923 and the Chinese Exclusion Act following that from 1923 to 1947 severely restricted immigration and family reunification, shaping the settlement patterns and community structures, which continue to reinforce that social inequality that Chinese people experienced during the construction of the railway. Um, and I want to take a moment and let that sink in for a second for everybody. That is a total of 62 years of legislative discrimination. and we're talking about millions of dollars collected by the Canadian government in the head tax between 1923 and 1885 and 1923. And we're talking about a total ban of Chinese immigrants coming into Canada between 1927 and 1923 and 1947. Um, and if you really think about it, 1947 is not a it's not a distant history. That's about 79 years ago. Um, However, in response to the discrimination, resilience emerges. Despite that racial barrier, despite the community development restrictions and immigration policy restrictions, um, community developed robust systems of social organizations within the including cultural institutions that allows family and individuals to survive and maintain their connection to their own culture, maintain that cultural continuity. Um, this period illustrates resilience not as passive and quietly endurance, but an active adaptation within the constraints and within the circumstances, within the hands that people were dealt. This era emphasized that Chinese Canadian history that did not pause after the railway. It is unfolded in this collective effort in despite of the head tax, the Exclusion Act, and the persistence of community building in face of that exclusion and discrimination. So the transition into this highlighted a critical shift from transient industrial labor to long-term community formation, exhibiting this moment underscores that railway was not really an end, but simply a pivot point, a point where Chinese Canadian could build communities and live and work and establish business, even though they face segregations, even though they face discriminations. These segregations created this phenomenon of Chinatown that we see today, where they have a community who support each other and carries on that Canadian Chinese heritage. So now I want to shift our focus then from history about Chinese Canadians to the heritage lived by us as a community every day. History is objective. There are evidence, there are photographs. We study the evidence and we understand what those events that took place. Well, the heritage really to me is this preservation, the celebration of the specific aspect of the past. So it's not just about the matter factual, it's not just about evidence, um, it's about um, the chosen value and the heritage is really not a static moment. It doesn't stop at museum walls. It doesn't stop at archive photographs that I was showing. It also does not have to be represented by this one single story, this one single moment in history. It's not just historical fact. And I hope that when you leave today's talk, that's the paradigm shift as you see how we experience that heritage going forward. So, as part of Asian Heritage Month, I want to highlight that yes, Chinese heritage in Canada is not confined to historical memory or archive displays. It is a living and evolving presence within the contemporary public institutions. the legacy of railway labor extends into modern transportation systems that continue to connect communities and support economic life. Um, Speaking from my own experience today, Chinese Canadians work across all levels of public transportation, contributing expertise, leadership, service in systems that mirror the national importance once held by the railway or the construction of the railway. This continuity, this resilience demonstrates how heritage can be actively lived rather than simply inherited. By drawing a line from this 19th century railway construction to 21st century urban transit, the narrative shifts from this marginalization to sustained contribution. So I'm honored that my professional experience in public transit amplifies this connection, illustrating how historical trajectories inform present day civil participation. And this perspective challenges static interpretation of heritage that minimize it to that single point of story, to those photographs. It invites the reflection of how past systems of mobility shape contemporary life, that shapes the life we live today. And I want to share some personal perspective to invite you and encourage you to unlearn um, what it is of a historical symbol that relates to that Canadian Pacific Railway and view the Chinese Canadian history as an ongoing story. Um, so in the past decade and a half, as Alex has mentioned, that I have worked in a number of roles in public transit in Toronto, and I'm currently the director of the fare cart team at the TTC, and I oversee fare payment systems performance in one of in Canada's largest transit agency, actually. So my professional experience spans in different areas, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity um, to talk about that, what that feels like and what that means, because it is such a huge part of my life, and I want to share with everyone and explain why the message that I'm emphasizing today about reframing cultural values, reframing identities, and reframing heritage is such important work. Um, Historical identities that were shaped by discriminatory policies such as the het tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act that I mentioned create a long-lasting legacy of social norm. And this is a social norm in the Chinese community. Um, Being the fact that 1947 was not that long ago, again, 79 years ago, um, it is a today's lasting norm. It goes far beyond how other people sees Chinese people living in Canada, but rather it's deeply embedded on how we see ourselves. How do we view ourselves, including this phenomenon that I like to call a diaspora paradox of some sort, where highly educated, professionally successful Chinese Canadians face unexpected barriers at the workplace, even for myself today. Because of our internal paradoxical beliefs, our identity, our parents, our culture raise many of us with values of humility, endurance, and silence. Um, I'm sure you have heard the expressions keep your head down and work hard, experience that hardship, appreciate the hardship, and let your work speak for itself, because only through hardship and sacrifice and endurance you can then enjoy the fruit of your hard work without seeking visibility, because hardship and humbleness represent our deep rooted values. On the other hand, when we experience the Canadian corporate world today, we realize that leaderships often value and reward individualistic visibility, assertiveness, self-promotion. We're walking into a room and dominating that room is really what often would be associated with having credibility, having competence. So there is an internal struggle that we experience. Um, and this is not incidental either. Remember the photograph of the last spy, and remember that hardship we endured during building this national railway, building this triumph. Um, and in the end, who was visible, dominating the historical moment? It was not us. And the moment along with the historical patterns of exclusion shaped how we see ourselves, shaped how we educate our children, and how others then see us. So compounding into this paradoxical belief. So personally for me, reframing heritage, reframing what that historical context um, meant for me, helped me understand that these internal conflicts are not personal failures. They're inherited. Um, they're they're the inherited systems and lived experiences that we now question for personal and professional growth. So as we move to conclude, I want to expand and challenge you to think beyond reframing the Chinese heritage and ask yourself, what does reframing heritage really mean or really means for you in its general sense? So for me, specifically, reframing this Chinese Canadian heritage requires moving beyond looking at that hardship only narrative that ties um, exclusively to that historical moment of the railway building, the contribution in that specific historical context. Well, the Canadian Pacific Railway remains fundamental and foundational. It represents only one chapter in a larger history, a longer story of contribution, resilience, and belonging. Um, and I think I would really encourage you and invite you to walk away today recognizing and celebrating our heritage, um, that Chinese Canadian heritage that shaped Canada's transportation system and public institutions across generations. So there's two important questions that I want to leave you with today through this presentation. The next time that you engage someone of Chinese heritage, how does this talk and this reframing of heritage, this shift in paradigm, change your perspective of them in better understanding that paradoxical belief that we live with? And that paradoxical belief that we live with, really it is stemmed from the historical challenges that we have faced. It stems from the the Chinese head tax. It stems from the Exclusion Act in immigration. Um, and secondly, and I think most importantly, I want you to think about um, how would you reframe your own heritage? It doesn't have to be a reframing of the Chinese heritage as personally it is for me. Um, what does it mean to reframe your own heritage in Canada? What does that mean to you, um, looking at history, Canadian history, and understanding how many of us are probably living with some paradoxical beliefs that may limit our growth personally and professionally. Um, so that concludes my presentation, and I hope this presentation encouraged you to reflect, question, and continue the conversation. I have two QR codes here on the screen. The one on the left will take you to the section of the website for Toronto Railway Museum, where a bit of Toronto history is celebrated in commemorating of Chinese heritage. So a short walk from the museums, there is a Chinese railway worker memorial, and you can learn more about today's topic on the website if you scan the QR code on the left. And of course, I'm to be happy to connect and continue this conversation, continue the discussion of these historical moments, infrastructure building in Canada, and of course the identity intersect in your own work and in your own heritage. So if you scan the QR code on the right, it'll lead you to my LinkedIn profile where you can connect with me. And that wraps up the talk today for me. I'll pass it back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Yeeman. I'll turn it over to Ryan for the Q&A. Looks like you have some quite thoughtful questions and comments here. So, Ryan, do you want to take over?
Yes, thank you, Alex. And thank you, Yeeman, for that fabulous presentation. It is a significant topic, especially in this month, but always to Canadian history, to those Canadians with Asian and Chinese ancestry. It is something that we've tried to implement in our own gallery at the museum as well, but there's always more work to be done. So thank you for highlighting this significant topic and approaching it in such an accessible way.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure.
I just again would like to encourage our attendees. If you do have a question for Yeeman, you can submit it in the Q&A box within the Zoom platform, and I'm happy to read those questions as they come through. So, Yeeman, this first question is from a listener, Nancy Graham. Nancy asks, in your opinion, has there been sufficient recognition of the major contribution of Chinese workers to the development of the Canadian railway system? And second point, has there been a plan developed for the opportunity for a heritage recognition at a site in the GTA, which has significant Chinese communities, and the new ongoing railway infrastructure? It's kind of a
Um,
two-part question there.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nancy, for those questions. That's very thoughtful. In response to the first part, in my opinion, I think um, there's never sufficient recognition um, of major contributions of the Chinese workers in that the Canadian railway system, the construction. Um, Partly because, as I mentioned, there were 62 years of systematic legislative discrimination followed the construction of the railway, um, where I think um, I believe it was in 20 or maybe 2006. I might have to fact check that, but I think it was 2006 that um, the prime minister officially apologized for that experience to the Chinese people who are impacted by those discriminatory legislations. And I think a simple apology and some symbolic payments are um, really not enough, as I don't see um, this as part of our history that is taught in school. I never experienced this conversation until later on in life when I'm in the public transportation industry and these conversations are being had. Um, so I would say no in terms of sufficient recognition. In terms of plans to develop opportunities for heritage recognition? Um, that's a good question, and I'm probably not at the liberty to really answer that, but I would really hope so. And I think that's why I want to highlight the work that Toronto Railway Museum is doing, and as well as that site for commemorating the Chinese labor um, in a short walk from the museum. That really is a dedicated space to explore and start the conversation of celebrating that heritage.
Mm. Thank you for that fulsome answer. Eamon, just a question for myself, just jumping off one of your comments
Yeah.
regarding the lack of this material in the curriculum and the education system in general.
Hmm.
Just wondering, in your professional career in the TTC and otherwise, has this ever come up as a topic of discussion, kind of given the link between rail, transit, and this history, especially in a city like Toronto?
Very rarely. I think as a professional, I experience this topic, and I think that's why I say that this is at the beginning of my presentation, I say that this is quite a personal and professional connection for me, this topic really. Only in May, because May is Asian Heritage Month, there are many conversations like this that happens around organizations in May. So I mean, I'm appreciative of this space and this opportunity in this month to speak of this piece of history because of the importance. Um, but no, I don't think there are enough of that conversation that happens around the workplace and around how we really frame that piece of history.
Hmm. I
Yeah,
think that adds to the value of having a talk like this one for the public. So
yeah, absolutely.
thanks for that. This next one is from Lynn Deachman. And Lynn asks, I'm wondering if the Chinese people were only laborers on the railway. Sorry, was it just Chinese people who were laborers, or were there other groups that were taken advantage of as well? Do you know that?
Um, to be honest, I don't. I don't think I'm the expert in this to say. But I'm going to say that that's a good question to explore, and I think this is a beginning. And as I say in the end of my presentation, this is a beginning. I hope this sparks questions like this and sparks conversations like this to have a better understanding on what that looks like for the railway because it is such a important piece of history in Canada alone, not just to the Chinese heritage, but as a piece of as a moment in time, um, because it is what really triggered the unification of the country. As I mentioned, British Columbia joined the Confederates because of the promise of the railway in 1871. I think without the railway, we wouldn't have the country that we have today. So that's where I think I appreciate questions like this to be triggered and to be asked and to be studied because, as you mentioned, we probably don't talk enough about this piece of history and from the perspective of who has been taken advantage of and how do we have recognition for that piece of history and heritage and what it means today.
Yeah, I believe that's well said. Thank you for that. This next question's a little bit longer, but it's an interesting one in that it does touch on the personal and the professional again for you. So this is from Andrew Jeans. He writes, in conversations about public transportation, contemporary China is often presented as a great success with its construction of a very extensive high-speed rail network in a relatively short time. People in Canada will sometimes say we could never build high-speed rail like they have in China. Do you have any thoughts about that framing in the media of the Chinese success and the capability compared with the construction of the Canadian self-image?
That's actually very interesting. Thank you, Andrew, for that question. Yes, I think I have absolutely often heard of that narrative of the advancement in railway construction. And if you look around the world, actually a couple of years ago, I was in Kenya and I see a railway constructed in Kenya by the Chinese investments from um, uh, Nairobi to Mombasa. And I was actually quite shocked of the state of the railway and how quickly they were able to construct that. Um, so it's not just in China that they're constructing railways, the high-speed railways. They're actually developing all around the world. As for the sense in Canada, personally, I think our transportation development is very conservative. There are a lot of political engagement that is associated with the infrastructure development, and there's really, I think, the sense of um, why we're unable to construct. I don't think it is the sense of technology. I don't think it is the sense of funding. I think in many cases, it is the sense of political discussions that forms our infrastructure building with the three level of government and funding sources and decision-making power in developing infrastructure, in developing railway, specifically building high-speed railway. It is a very different political environment, and I think that plays a heavy role on those decisions being made. Um, I think that framing maybe have left out some of that political environment discussion rather than the ability. I think any country anywhere is probably able in the sense of technology, in the sense of funding, in the sense of infrastructure development, but there's many differences between the two countries themselves.
Thank you for that fine analysis, an international analysis, Yeeman. Quick comment here from Sandy, but I think it's a relevant one. Sandy says, thanks to the organizer, of course, for providing such a valuable learning opportunity, and special thanks to the speaker for the excellent presentation. I think this touches upon, Yeeman, one of these thread throughs, and that is we all see it's an important topic, but perhaps it's underappreciated or as not as well known as it ought to be as a part of Canadian history. So some appreciation there from Sandy.
Thank you.
Uh, Another question from Nancy. Is there a way for us to push or advocate for a significant way to recognize the historic contributions of Chinese labor workers and our railway system?
Yeah, thank you. It- I think I think there's always a way to advocate how we experience any moment in history. There's definitely ways to advocate what that really means for Chinese heritage, which obviously I appreciate your everybody joining this conversation today, because I think that really has an impact, like you being here today, and as rightfully pointed out by Sandy, the um, organizer, and also my presentation today. I think that's the first step, where bringing awareness in terms of understanding what that reframing look like, what that conversation look like, and how do we critically looking at history. And I think that's why I wanted to highlight in my presentation that history is evidence, is facts, is what took place. Um, but what really is meaningful is how do we celebrate that heritage? And I think Nancy, that's probably what you're rightfully pointing out. How do we push that narrative of understanding, awareness, and celebration, because it is lived. It is part of us today. It is part of our lives today, and it's part of how we experience the world today. So I think this is the first step. For me, this is the first step. I've never publicly spoke about this topic. So for me, this is the first step. And for many of you, it could be the first step um, to critically look at what Chinese heritage means in Canada, and also what many other heritage means in Canada. I was on a meeting the other day about FIFA at work, and I learned that there are 240 languages that are spoken in the city of Toronto. And that's quite shocking for me, but at the same time, I realize how diverse our community really is and what it means um, to carry and celebrate your own heritage. And I think that's why in the end of my presentation, I mentioned that I hope what you take away today is what celebrating your own heritage means, what reframing your own heritage means, and questioning how history impact what we see today. And yes, I think there's definitely a need to quote unquote push that celebration. And I'm grateful that there is Asian Heritage Month and being part of this conversation.
Thank you. I think that is a very suitable last question and a very fine conclusion from you, Yeeman, in terms of the takeaways from this.
Thank
Uh,
you.
so, so thank you, and I will pass it over to Alex to wrap it up.
Oh, thank you once again, Yeeman. Is there any last thoughts you would like to share with our audience tonight before we close out?
No, I think this has been a very thoughtful conversation. I really appreciate the questions. It's um I appreciate everybody being here and sharing this moment with me.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And if people are interested, there are a number of events related to Chinese heritage and rail throughout the year. On July 1st, there is a celebration at the Workers' Memorial on the other side of the Rogers Center from where we are at the Railway Museum. So every July 1st, there is an event there to commemorate sadly the date of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I know there's a dinner every November 7th for the date of the completion. And that is by, I always get I have to check the name, the Foundation to Commemorate the Chinese Railway Workers in Canada. So there are a number of events throughout the year, not just in May. And we look forward to sharing more of this history at our museum as well throughout the year. So thanks everyone so much. Enjoy the summer. We will see you back in the fall once again for a whole new slate of speakers exploring some new topics, some old topics. And if you have any ideas for topics or speakers, please reach out to us as well, and we will try to incorporate them into our series. So thank you so much, Yeeman. We look forward to giving you a mini train ride. Mini train starts on Friday, so stop by the museum with your crew, and we'll give you a loop around the park.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Ryan. And thanks, everyone.
Okay, everyone, have a good night, and we'll see you
Good night.
at Roundhouse Park.
Thank you. Bye.